First of all, though, I've mentioned deficit approach a couple of times, and I'm not going to labour this point, but I think it deserves a little bit of mention. If I said that, look, you're a deficit teacher, deficit approach teacher, you'd probably be quite affronted by that. It's got negative connotations. The whole basis of it is that people lack something. And I mean, I've got a quote there from Heather Ridout now. She was the CEO of the Australian Industry Group, and she provides a classic example of a deficit approach to language literacy and numeracy at a broader level. I mean, part of the way through that quote there, she said, look, there are 7 million people in the Australian workforce that just can't do it. They can't read standard operating procedures, for example, which leads to all sorts of safety issues and poor use of machinery. Now, I know she was talking very loosely because it was in a radio broadcast, but that gives you an idea. That's a classic deficit approach. Look, there's 7 million people in Australia that just can't do it. But if we look at more at the program type of level, the workplace level, what are the key elements of a deficit-oriented approach? First of all, if someone's going to be in deficit, you have to have some sort of standard by which to determine that they are in deficit, that they lack something. So there has to be a set of standards. And in Australia, we have something called the Australian Core Skills Framework. I don't know enough about New Zealand, but I think you have learning progressions and similar type of thing. Essentially, they are standards that are being set. A group of experts gets together and decides these are the different levels that are required, and sometimes they decide on a particular benchmark that's okay if it's level 3 in the ACSF in Australia, or you might have a different level. So a deficit model of workplace, first of all, we have to have a predetermined, externally defined standards. And the idea is that students or workers are assessed according to those standards to determine if there's a gap between their particular individual ability and these standards. So very often we have pre-course assessments. When someone comes into a course, we assess them. We've got programs in Australia. There's a workplace English language and literacy program, the World program. The first thing that they do in that program is to assess all the workers to find out what level they're at. It's normally the first stage. There's a language literacy and numeracy program for job seekers as well. And the idea is you assess everyone to start with, and you assess them at the end, and you see if they've bridged that gap. And then the aim is usually through various sort of remedial strategies to reduce that gap. Now, this is the paradigm of vocational education and training. It's what we all work within, I should think. I'm just the same. In the 20 years that I worked in the TAFE system in New South Wales, I was part of this system as well. I mean, every year I used to go down to the carpentry students at the beginning of the year and give them a little screening test and identify the students that were going to have the problems. Then a few days later, I'd go back to the teacher and say, look, I think there's half a dozen students here who are going to struggle in your class. We do it. It's a natural paradigm that we operate within, and it's quite difficult, I think, for us to see outside of this deficit paradigm. I've got teachers in TAFE New South Wales. They call themselves, we're doing gap training. That's actually what they call it, gap training. Well, I'm not necessarily saying there's anything wrong with that approach, but there could be some things wrong with the deficit approach. And there are three issues there that I think could impact in a deficit-oriented approach. It could have a negative impact on the student's self-concept. I mean, I've been involved in adult literacy since 1980. My first job was working in New South Wales prisons as a remedial teacher. And the very first, the beginning of the literature that I started to look at, even around 1980, that was full of information about how adult literacy students, how negative experiences in their schooling and being told they're not good enough and failing, has affected them in a negative way in their self-concept. And the literature on adult literacy and numeracy is littered with studies of students feeling bad about being labelled inadequate and lacking. Now, I'm not saying this affects everyone, but who knows? We don't, you know, those carpentry students that I saw every year, and I identified them in the classroom, and the teacher said, look, would you 6 people stay behind afterwards, blah, blah, blah. I don't know when they left the classroom whether they'd been called dumbos or something by their other friends, or I don't know how it affected those individual students, but they were being defined as lacking, and it could affect people in different ways. A second possible negative impact is the teacher's expectation. When you know that a group of students that they've been labelled lacking in literacy and numeracy, you perhaps unconsciously, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The way you teach them could be slightly different. I mean, when I did my teacher training back in the early 1970s, we were all told about this self-fulfilling prophecy. There was, I've forgotten, Jacobson and Rosenthal and Jacobson, and they did their study in the late 1960s, and of when you tell a teacher that they've got a class of high IQ students, and you compare with when you tell a teacher that you've got a low performing group, their expectations are higher for a higher performing group, and the results are that those students actually end up doing better. So there's a possible negative effect on the teacher's expectation in identifying a group as being lacking. And also I think there's a tendency for teachers, when you've got a group that have been identified in deficit in some way, there's a tendency to teach them differently. You think, oh look, these guys, that's going to be too difficult for them. I'll have to rewrite that in simpler terms. There's a tendency to say, let's go back to the basics. You know, let's go back to, look, you're having trouble reading that. Let's go back to these basic sort of phonics skills to make sure you've got those. Or you're having problems with this calculation. Let's go right back to the basics. And you end up getting further and further away from the real life context of where they have to use those literacy and numeracy skills. In a research study I did last year on supporting the literacy and numeracy support to teachers in vocational education, there was a teacher that we spoke to in Western Australia. He said that the whole issue really is motivation. Very often you get these young kids who have failed at school. They hated maths, they hated English, but they come in and now they've been a tiler. It's completely different. When they know they have to write up a quote for a job, they jolly well learn. They're motivated to learn how to write that quote, whereas in a formal sense in school they may have failed, but their motivation is completely different. A social practices approach, how could this be different? This is all based on this company that we researched in our study. We found that the focus is really on how literacy and numeracy are completely embedded in the workplace practices. So embedded that you can't actually extricate the literacy and numeracy element from them. So the primary focus in this company I'll be talking about is the workplace practices. Literacy and numeracy are embedded in those practices, but they don't try and separate literacy and numeracy out from it. They're only interested really, let's face it, a company is only interested in how its workers perform the job. The focus is on the practices. There was no assessment of the workers' literacy and numeracy skills. That wasn't their focus. The focus was on how they performed in the workplace practices. All the workers received training in different aspects, not just those in deficit. So they weren't separating out people who needed special help. And most of the training that did go on was actually at the workstation, in the work teams. There was very little training that went on in a training room. It was there at the interface in the team that the training was going on. And to research how this happens, this learning, or to analyse it, really involves a close observation, and you have to spend a lot of time in workplaces to really understand how these workplace practices are being used.